Hi everybody, welcome back. This is Dr. Z. We're in chapter 27. We're going to talk more about Italian fascism with a focus on Mussolini and how he came to power. So, we have to remember that in Italy, the loss after World War I was tremendous. 1 million men were lost on the Austrian front, and the economy was very bad after World War I. There also was a global agricultural depression at this time, and the Great Depression, of course, in 1929. In Italy, the sort of overall thought was that universal suffrage had resulted in parliamentary chaos, right? That because all men were voting, that democracy was not really functional, and it was slow and disappointing. And there were many different groups within the parliament, and socialists had power after their first elections, but this made industrialists and Catholics also very nervous. And so, as we talked about in the last video, sort of the conditions were quite ripe after World War I for the rise of a strong leader who would pull people out of this economic slump. Who was Mussolini? He was a socialist, and he edited a socialist journal called The People of Italy. Okay, he also was injured and was a veteran from World War I. He had the belief that I could lead a revolution, but not a socialist one. He didn't think socialism was going to sustain the country after the war. But because he was an editor, he really understood the power of language. And along with many of the veterans at the time, he saw a rising problem, and that was the rising tide of communism. And the Bolsheviks are going to be the scapegoat target group of the fascists in Italy. Fascists first organized themselves in small groups that were called fascisti, black shirts. And these small groups arose in cities all around Italy and waged street warfare against communists. It was almost a civil war for control of the press, for control of neighborhoods and cities. And fascists and communists were, really just fighting their way across Italy in the early 1920s. We're talking about 1919, 1920, 1921. By 1922, though, Mussolini orchestrates we have to remember, he really is a master of the media as an editor of the press, and he orchestrates which is called the March on Rome, or I call it the so-called March on Rome. And basically what this is, through a lot of propaganda and political manipulations, he wants to take over the Roman government, the federal government in Rome. And so he goes in and, takes over, but it's a quiet takeover. It is a fairly nonviolent takeover. And he doesn't think that this is going to pass muster in the sense of what people, will believe in, and certainly won't make him look like a strong ruler. So he orchestrates the March on Rome and calls all of these fascist groups to take trains to Rome, and he has it all filmed. So it looks like a military takeover, but it actually wasn't in the least bit. And it was completely orchestrated with propaganda to show that he had taken over with bravado, but, he hadn't. What then are some ideas, right? They believed that large businesses were draining Italy's resources. Violence was a useful tool. They did not like unions, workers' unions, right? Because they upheld industrialists. They certainly did not like communism and defined themselves against it. Fascists overthrew city governments, and until the consolidation of power, they were a minor party on a national level. This propaganda poster says, "Thanks to the March on Rome, we aren't marching on Moscow," right? And there's the fascist black shirt fighting the Russian bear and cracking it at its foundation. So the consolidation of Mussolini's power in 22 and 23 starts in, there's a sort of a domino effect. So Parliament becomes a rubber stamp for the fascists because of a rule that says any party that receives 50% of the vote gets 2/3 of the seats. So with fascists having executive control and legislative control, there's really nothing to stop them in the sense of the government or checks and balances. Mussolini also the following year suspends the constitution and assumes a full dictatorial power in Italy. And by 1926, the parliament outlaws any political opposition to the fascists. So by 1928, the full state is built, right? And if we think of, from 1920 to 1928, it's 8 short years of the denigration of democracy. One of the main reasons, though, we kind of have to ask ourselves, like, what's going on with this? And Mussolini, I think, saw himself as an emperor a little bit early on, because in February of 1929, he and Pope Pius XI got together and signed what was called the Fourth Lateran Treaty. And this created the political state of the Vatican City. The sovereignty of the Pope was enshrined in this document. He said that all Italian marriage laws coming out of the Parliament would conform with Catholic ideas. And for example, divorce isn't legalized until much later. I think it's probably around the 1970s in Italy when divorce is finally legalized. And from this, Mussolini receives the support of the Catholic Church, who initially had been hesitant. But I want you to remember, though, that as fascism continues in Italy, some of the strongest opposition to it are going to be the Catholics, and particularly their radio station. And Roman Catholicism then is declared as the official state religion. We have to remember that he did not do this all by himself. The idea for this, of course, in many ways is very similar to Napoleon's Concordat that he signed with the Pope, right? Reestablishing France as a Christian nation. And we have to remember that after World War I, and certainly moving into the 20th century, Europeans in general were feeling a little bit less interested in religion. And so this really solidifies Italy as a Catholic country and that relationship between church and state once again. All right, when we come back, we are going to talk a little bit more about the economy under fascism and imperialism, and some of the cultural and social aspects of that in Italy at the time. Thank you.